In your dreams, Granny. This path's for people who earned it. So keep it moving." The voice came from a young man in a pressed gray uniform, and it carried across the quad the way young men's voices do when they are performing for other young men. It bounced off the cold granite and came back thinner. The morning was overcast, the sky the flat color of a coin, and the stone walkway that crossed the Academy's central lawn was slick with the night's rain. Cadet Sergeant Blake Ferris stood in the middle of that walkway with two others behind him, and directly in front of him, moving at the pace of someone who had learned the hard way that hurrying costs more than it saves, was an old woman in a plain red coat. She did not answer him. She did not hurry. She only shifted her weight the way a person does who has stood on worse ground than a wet lawn, and she kept walking. The Academy was older than any war the cadets had studied, and younger than the ones the old woman had fought. Its buildings sat in a square around the quad, like veterans around a fire, gray and weather-stained and patient, and the stone path that crossed the lawn had been worn smooth by a century of boots belonging to people who were now names on walls. On a clear day, the parade field beyond the hall would be full of formations and shouted cadence. On this cold morning, with the sky the color of a coin and the season turning, it was mostly empty, and the only formation on the quad was the loose knot of cadets who had decided that an old woman's slow progress across their mourning was a thing worth stopping for. She came the way she came every year on this date. She parked her small car in the visitor lot by the gate. She signed the log in careful old-fashioned handwriting, and she walked the long way across the quad to the gray hall, because the walking was part of it, because a person should have to work a little to stand in front of a thing like the one she had come to stand in front of. She had done this for 11 years, since the day they dedicated the building, and in 11 years, no one had ever bothered her. This was the first year that anyone had. That refusal to react was, to Ferris, an invitation. He stepped sideways to stay in front of her, grinning back at his friends, and the cadet named Miles Fontaine laughed the loud, easy laugh of a boy who has never once been afraid. A third cadet lifted a phone and began to film, because everything now was something to be filmed. "Ma'am," Ferris said, drawing the word out. "The senior center tour is by the front gate. This is the cadet path. You're kind of ruining the whole vibe." The old woman stopped. She looked at him for the first time, and there was nothing in her face at all. No fear, no anger, not even the tired patience of an old person used to being talked down to. Her eyes were pale and steady, and they did not flinch. Then she looked past him, over his shoulder, at the gray stone building 30 feet farther on, and she began to walk again, angling to go around him. Ferris put out an arm. Not a shove. Not yet. Just an arm, laid across the air like a gate. "Grass is that way," he said, tipping his head toward the wet lawn. "Paths for us." She stepped off the walkway onto the grass without a word. Her low shoes found the turf. Her cane touched down and held. She did not slip, did not wobble, did not make the small, helpless sounds that the cadets were half expecting and would have found funny. She simply walked on the grass, parallel to the path they had denied her, and her eyes never left the building ahead. From the shadow of the north colonnade, a man in gray coveralls stopped sweeping. His name was Amos Crutchfield, and he was 67 years old, and before he had ever pushed a broom across this campus, he had spent 26 years in the Army, the last 8 of them as a first sergeant. He had seen a great many people walk across a great many pieces of dangerous ground, and he knew the difference between how a frightened person moves and how a dangerous one does. Frightened people watch the thing that scares them. This old woman was not watching the cadets at all. She was watching the windows. She was watching the corners of the building. She had checked, without seeming to, where the walls were and where a person could go. "Now where?" Crutchfield said quietly. "To no one? Does an old woman learn to stand like that?" He leaned his broom against a column and started along the colonnade, slow, keeping the group in the corner of his eye. Crutchfield had come to the academy the way a lot of old soldiers come to places like it, sideways and grateful, and without making a fuss about the 26 years that had come before the coveralls. He raked the leaves and salted the walks and changed the great flags on the parade field, and he kept, without anyone asking him to, a private accounting of the men and women whose names were cut into the walls of the buildings he cleaned. He knew the stories the plaques did not tell. He knew which halls were named for people who had earned it in an office, and which were named for people who had earned it somewhere with no name at all. And he knew, because he had made it his business to know, exactly whose face was on the bronze plaque inside the doors of the gray hall the old woman would not stop looking at. He had never met her. She came on a weekday morning once a year, and she never went inside while anyone was watching, and he had always given her the distance a person like that so plainly wanted. But he knew the walk. He had seen that exact economy of motion before, on other old soldiers who had done things the country would never fully admit to, and it turned the thing in his chest another notch tighter as he came down the colonnade. Out on the grass, Ferris wasn't finished. A thing that will not rattle is a thing a certain kind of young man cannot leave alone. He fell into step beside her on the walkway, looking down at her, still grinning for the camera. "Come on, I'm just messing with you," he said. "What are you even doing out here? You lost?" "No," the old woman said. Her voice was low and dry and entirely calm. "I'm not lost." She did not slow down. She did not look at him. She looked at the letters cut into the stone above the door of the gray hall, and she walked toward them across the cold, wet grass in her plain red coat. And above her, the flat sky held its color, and the answer to every question the boys were laughing at was already there, carved and waiting, 30 feet away, and unread. Crutchfield watched her go, and the thing in his chest that he could not yet name tightened by one notch, and he kept walking. Fontaine jogged a few steps and planted himself in front of her again, arms wide, playing to the phone. "Seriously, ma'am, the tour's the other way. You're going to get all muddy over here. Let me point you toward the nice bench." "The building I'm going to," the old woman said, "is the one with the north colonnade, facing the parade field. I've been walking to it since before you could walk at all. I know exactly where I am." The words landed oddly. They were not the words of a confused visitor. They were the flat, oriented words of someone reading terrain. Bearings, facings, fixed points. Fontaine did not know what to do with them, so he laughed again. But the laugh came a half-beat late. Crutchfield heard the words, too, from 20 feet off, and they stopped him where he stood. North Colonnade, facing the parade field. Nobody talked about the campus that way, except the people who had built their whole lives inside. Places that had to be described, precisely because describing them wrong got people killed. Ferris reached out and took her by the forearm, lightly, still for the camera, still a joke. Okay, let me help you along then. Wouldn't want you to trip." His fingers closed on the sleeve of the red coat and pulled, and the cuff slid up her wrist, and there on the old, thin skin of her forearm was a tattoo. It had faded to the color of a bruise under years of sun, the lines soft and blurred, but the shape of it was still readable to a man who had spent his life around such things. Crutchfield saw it, and the breath went out of him. It was not a unit crest that anybody put on a recruiting poster. It was the kind of mark that men he had known wore under their sleeves and did not explain. The ink of a thing that had never officially happened, in a place they had never officially been. "Son," Crutchfield said, louder now, moving. But the cadets did not hear him. They were laughing at the tattoo. "What is that, a prison tat?" Fontaine said. "You do time, Grandma?" The old woman did not pull her arm back. She did not cover the tattoo. She let them look at it, and she let them laugh at it. And she stood in the middle of their laughter, with the stillness of a statue that had been carved out of weathered granite and left standing through 100 winters. To Ferris and Fontaine, that stillness read as weakness, an old woman too slow to fight back. To Crutchfield, closing the last of the distance, it read as the most controlled thing he had seen in 20 years. His hand went to the phone in the pocket of his coveralls. He wrapped his fingers around it, and then he stopped, because he wanted to be certain before he lit a fuse he would not be able to put back out. More cadets were drifting over now, a knot of gray uniforms, drawn by the laughter the way people are always drawn to laughter, forming a loose ring on the walkway, with the old woman and Ferris at its center. Ferris felt the audience grow and grew with it. He let go of her arm and spread his hands. A showman. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it appears the senior center has misplaced one of theirs. Somebody call the front desk. Tell them Gladys wandered off during arts and crafts." The ring laughed. It was a good line, and they were young, and it was easy. A few of them did not laugh. A boy at the back, a cadet named Emmett Rowe, shifted his weight and looked at his boots and wished he were somewhere else. But none of them stepped forward. None of them ever do in the moment. That is the whole terrible truth of it. The mockery found its rhythm, the way a crowd's cruelty always does once it decides it has permission. One cadet did an impression of a slow shuffle. Another asked, loudly, whether she needed him to call her a ride. Or do they still let you drive at your age? A third wondered whether she was somebody's grandmother come to the wrong graduation. Each line got its laugh, and each laugh made the next line easier, and the old woman stood in the center of the widening circle and gave them nothing to push against. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not do the thing that would have fed them, which was to get flustered or afraid. She simply stood and waited, the way a stone in a river waits, and the water broke around her and went on being water. Miles Fontaine, emboldened, reached out and flicked the collar of her red coat. This is a nice coat, actually. Real fancy for the bingo hall. You win this at bingo, ma'am. No, the old woman said. It was the only word she gave him, and she gave it without any heat at all. And somehow, that single flat syllable was worse than any comeback could have been. Fontaine's grin flickered and did not fully come back. Someone in the ring called out, "Hey, what did you even do that's so special? You act like you own the place." For the first time, the old woman answered a question at length. She did not raise her voice. She spoke into the middle of the ring, the way a person speaks when the words cost them something, and they say them anyway. "I carried men who are better than any of you will ever be," she said. "Out of places you will spend your whole safe lives never having to go. That's all. That's the whole thing. Now let me pass." There was a beat of silence. It was almost enough. In another crowd, on another morning, it might have been enough. "Sure you did," Ferris said, and jerked his thumb toward the grass. "Off the path, Grandma." The ring laughed again, and the moment closed, and the old woman lowered her eyes not in shame, but in something that looked, to the one man watching who understood it, like grief. Grief for the boys, not for herself. Crutchfield had heard enough. He raised his voice so it cut across the whole ring. "That's enough. All of you. Knock it off and let that woman walk where she wants to walk." Ferris turned, saw the old man in coveralls, and waved a lazy hand. Relax, Pops. Go sweep something. We're just having a conversation. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, stay with this one and subscribe to the Veteran Vault. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes on that quad is the reason this channel exists. Crutchfield did not go sweep something. He planted himself at the edge of the ring, and for the first time the cadets registered that the old caretaker was not going away, and a small uncertainty moved through the group like a draft under a door. But Ferris had an audience, and an audience is a debt a certain kind of young man will bankrupt himself to pay. Stung by the caretaker, watched by 30 of his peers, he could not now simply walk away. Walking away would be losing. So he did the thing that boys do when pride has painted them into a corner. He escalated. He stepped off the path onto the grass, took the old woman's sleeve again, firmer this time, no longer a joke, and began to steer her, to march her physically toward the front gate, away from the gray hall she would not stop looking at. "Come on," he said, and his voice had lost its laugh. "I'm walking you out. Tour's over." The cane came up off the turf as he pulled her, and for a moment her balance belonged to him, and not to her, and the ring went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when a joke has just become something else. "Son," the old woman said, very quietly, "take your hand off my arm." "Or what?" Ferris said. She did not answer. But something happened that only Crutchfield, standing close now, was positioned to see. Inside the boy's grip, her wrist turned, a quarter of an inch, no more, testing the angle of his thumb, the exact small motion of a person who knows precisely how a hold is broken, and precisely how much force it would take. It was not a struggle, it was a measurement, and having measured it, she let the wrist go still again, deliberately, a decision made and set down, and she allowed the boy to keep holding her arm as though he had power over her. Crutchfield saw the measurement and the choice, and he understood that he was watching a person decide, in real time, not to hurt a child. He turned and moved, not toward Ferris, but toward the hall, toward the duty phone inside the door and the plaque beside it, because he had made up his mind, and he was going to end this the right way. The camera cadet narrated softly for the video. "We got a live one, folks. Old lady versus the United States Army. Place your bets." The old woman's eyes moved once, a single clean sweep. She clocked the boy's balance, high and forward and careless. She clocked his grip, all in the fingers, nothing in the base. She clocked the low stone lip of the flower bed a step behind his heel, exactly where a man would go down hard if his feet were taken. The audience saw none of it. For one breath, the operator was fully present behind the pale, steady eyes, and then she relaxed, on purpose, every muscle, and let it all go, because she had not carried what she carried across that river in 1968 to break a foolish boy's arm on a lawn in front of his friends. Crutchfield reached the ring's near edge and put himself squarely between the old woman and the gate Ferris was trying to march her toward. He was not a large man anymore, and he was not young, but he set his boots on the wet stone, and he looked at Blake Ferris with 2 decades of hard authority in his face, and his voice came out low and flat and absolutely certain. "Cadet, you let go of that woman right now. You have no idea whose ground you are standing on." Ferris laughed, but it was a shorter laugh than before. An old janitor and an old lady, real scary. "You're right," Crutchfield said. "I'm nobody. I push a broom." He did not move. "But you're going to want to be very sure about her before you take one more step." The filming cadet lowered the phone an inch. Something in the caretaker's face had reached him. Crutchfield turned his head, found the uneasy boy at the back of the ring, the one who had been looking at his boots. "Cadet, you. What's your name?" "Rowe, sir. Emmett Rowe. Mr. Rowe, I need you to run. Superintendent's staff office, top of the hall, fast as you've got. You tell whoever you find there 4 words, exactly these 4 words, and you don't stop for anybody. You understand me?" Rowe swallowed. "What words, sir?" Crutchfield's eyes went for just a moment to the old woman standing quiet in the boy's grip, and then back. "Tell them. Blackthorn is here." The old woman's chin lifted 1 degree. It was the first thing all morning that had touched her. Rowe hesitated. The whole strangeness of it. An order from a groundskeeper. 4 words that meant nothing to him. And then something in the air told him it wasn't nothing, and he turned and ran, his boots hitting the stone in a hard, clean rhythm that carried across the quad. The rhythm of the running boots did something to the whole quad. It was a sound every person there had been trained to respond to, the sound of somebody moving with purpose toward authority, and it changed the weather of the morning. A few of the cadets in the ring stopped smiling. The filming cadet looked at his phone as though he had only just realized what was on it. Even Fontaine, who had been enjoying himself more than anyone, went quiet and took a half step back toward the edge of the group, distancing himself in the small, instinctive way people do when they begin to suspect they are on the wrong side of something. Crutchfield did not take his eyes off Ferris. "Last time, cadet," he said. "Let her go. I have been on this campus 11 years, and I have never once raised my voice on this quad, and I am telling you that you are about 90 seconds from the worst morning of your young life, and it has almost nothing to do with me. Let her go." Ferris looked at the old caretaker, and he looked at the old woman, and for the first time all morning, a real doubt crossed his face. Not enough to make him do the right thing, because his pride still had him by the collar, but enough that his grip loosened. By a degree he did not notice he had surrendered. Ferris watched him go and tried to laugh it off, but the laugh would not fully come. Instead, he tightened his grip on the old woman's arm, and near the flower bed, his own heel slid on the wet stone lip, and he lurched half a step. "Watch your footing," the old woman said, quietly, automatically, steadying him with the arm he was holding. "Stone's slick. You'll go down on that edge and crack your head, and I'd rather you didn't." She had corrected her tormentor's balance. She had reached out, on reflex, to keep the boy who was manhandling her from falling and hurting himself, and that, more than any threat, more than the caretaker's certainty, was the thing that finally frightened Blake Ferris, though he could not have said why. What the boy in the pressed uniform did not know is exactly what the next few minutes were about to teach him. Subscribe so you do not miss the moment it lands. Because Emmett Rowe was already halfway up the hall steps, and the name he was about to read was going to rearrange the entire morning. 58 years earlier, on a night with no moon, Margaret Sutton was 22 years old, and already the calmest person in any dark she had ever stood in. There were 6 of them on the team, and officially they were not there at all. The border they had crossed did not appear on any order that would ever be signed, and the river they were moving toward was in a country their government would spend years insisting they had never entered. Sutton went by a single word on the radio, a word chosen for her by a team sergeant who said she was hard to see coming and worse to run into in the dark. The word was Blackthorn. She was on point of the withdrawal, which meant she was the one reading the ground. Every route, every game trail, every place the earth changed sound under a boot. The insertion had gone clean. The reconnaissance had gone clean. It was the coming home that came apart, the way it so often does at the water. There had been 6 of them, and she could still, 58 years later, say every name in the dark without stumbling. There was the team sergeant, a lean, quiet Tennessean who had chosen her for the element, when choosing her was not a thing that was done, and who had told the men who objected that he did not care what she was. He cared what she could do, and what she could do was read ground in the dark better than any soldier he had ever served with. There was the radio operator, barely 19, who hummed hymns under his breath when he was frightened and did not know he did it. There was the medic and the heavy weapons man, and there was Eli Hartshorn, and there was her. They had gone in 3 nights before to watch a stretch of trail that was not supposed to exist and count things that were not supposed to be moving along it, and they had done the job clean, lying in the wet green dark and writing down numbers that would matter to men in air-conditioned rooms 1,000 miles away. Sutton had been the one who found the way in and the one trusted to find the way out, and on the way out, she had walked point through country that wanted to kill them quietly, and she had brought them all the way back to the river before the country decided to kill them loudly instead. The river was the last thing between the team and the border. It was wide and slow and the color of tea, and the plan was to cross it in the last black hour before dawn. And the plan was a good one, and it did not survive contact. Something on the far bank had been waiting, or had gotten lucky, and when the first 2 men were in the water, the whole far tree line opened up at once, muzzle flashes stitching the dark, rounds walking across the surface of the river in little silver lines. She did not freeze. Freezing was a thing that happened to other people. She got the near-bank men down and returning fire. She got the men in the water, moving instead of stopping. And she put herself where the point walker puts herself when it all comes apart, which is between the trouble and the people she is responsible for. They were compromised at the river. The far bank lit up. In the noise and the dark, Corporal Eli Hartshorn, 24 years old, a farm kid from a state of flat gold fields, the man who had taught her to fish off a pier in another life a year before, went into the current covering the crossing, and he did not come up the way a man is supposed to come up. Sutton got the team across. That was the job, and she did the job. She put 4 living men on the friendly bank, and then she went back into the river for the 5th, because leaving him was not a thing that existed inside her. "Leave the pack, Peg," Hartshorn told her when she reached him, his voice already going far away. "Not me. Leave me. Get up the—" "Nobody's getting left," she said, with the water pulling at both of them and the far bank still burning. "Hold on to me. That's an order, Corporal. Hold on." She brought him across with her back against the current, and his hand in hers, and she carried him up the mud, and she held on to him through the worst hours a person can hold on to another person. Restraint is a mercy the years teach you. What happened by that river is not a thing to be shown. It is enough to say that she got the living home, and that Eli Hartshorn did not live to see the dawn, and that when the dawn came, it found a 22-year-old woman sitting in the mud with a dead man's dog tag pressed into her palm so hard it left a shape in her skin. She did not weep that morning. The weeping came later, years later, in ordinary places. A kitchen, a bus, a hardware store aisle, arriving without warning and leaving the same way. On the bank at dawn, she only sat and held the tag and made the 4 living men a promise she never spoke aloud, that she would carry them the rest of the way, all of them, for as long as she had a body to carry anything, and that she would carry him longest of all. She kept that promise the way she kept every promise, quietly and completely, and without expecting anyone to notice. She stayed in the army because the army was where the men she had saved could still find her. She rose over the decades, from the young point walker on that bank to a command sergeant major, whose name younger soldiers said with a particular hush. And through all of it, she never once told the story of the river to anyone who had not been standing in it with her. They pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on her some months later in a room with no windows, and read a citation that could not describe where any of it had happened. She stood at attention and let them do it. She would spend the next 50 years refusing, gently and completely, to talk about that night, to anyone who had not been in the river with her. The tattoo on her forearm was the mark of the men who had. The call sign was the name the dark had given her, and a dog tag with the name Eli Hartshorn stamped into it had written in her pocket, from that river to this quad, for 58 years. The same hand that had closed around that tag at dawn in 1968 was the hand, old now and spotted and strong, that rested this cold morning on a wet academy lawn. Back on the quad, the reckoning had not yet come, and Blake Ferris was running out of ways to save face. The caretaker would not move. The old woman would not rattle. His friend had run off on some fool's errand for a janitor. 30 cadets were watching him lose a contest with an 80-year-old woman, and losing was the one outcome his pride could not survive. So he did the last stupid thing available to a boy in that corner. He shoved her. It was not a hard shove, as shoves go. His palm caught her shoulder and pushed, the way you would push a turnstile, meaning only to move her, to make the point that he could. But she was old, and the grass was wet, and she went down onto one knee on the turf, her cane skidding away, her palm coming flat against the cold ground. A sound went through the ring, a sharp, collective intake, the sound a crowd makes when a joke it was part of turns, all at once, into something it wants no part of. Fontaine's grin fell off his face. The filming cadet took an involuntary step back. "I told you to move," Ferris said, but his voice had gone high and uncertain, a boy hearing his own words and not liking them. The old woman knelt on the grass with her palm flat against the earth, and she breathed once, slow, all the way in and all the way out. And the audience understood now, because they had seen the wrist turn, because they had seen her steady him at the flower bed, that she had not needed to go down. She had the balance. She had the training. She could have kept her feet, or taken his, or ended the whole thing in a single economical motion. She took the knee instead. She chose the grass. Where rage should have been, there was only that terrible granite stillness, and it was louder than any scream. The cadets felt it before they understood it. There is a kind of silence a dangerous person makes, a silence with weight and edges, and the whole ring of young people had gone into that silence now without deciding to. The joke was over. Everyone knew the joke was over. What none of them yet knew was what was going to replace it, and the not knowing pressed down on the quad like a held breath. Fontaine had stopped grinning entirely. The filming cadet had lowered the phone. Emmett Rowe's absence was a hole in the group that everyone could feel, and along the far edge of the parade field there was a sense, more than a sight, of something moving, of doors opening and word traveling, of the whole morning gathering itself toward a single point. Then, in one clean and unhurried motion that did not use the cane and did not use her hands against the ground, she rose. She came up off her knee the way a much younger and much harder person rises, all of it from the legs, none of it a struggle, and she stood in front of Blake Ferris, and she held his eyes, and she did not blink. Ferris took a step backward. He did not decide to. His body did it for him. "You'll want to remember this minute," the old woman said, very quietly, just to him. "The rest of it. Every second of it. Because you are going to be explaining it for the rest of your life, and you'll want to have it right." Across the parade field, at the top of the hall's stone steps, a door banged open hard enough to be heard across the whole quad, and a man in the service uniform of a general officer came through it, and he came down those steps at a walk that was almost a run. Emmett Rowe had not made it all the way to the staff office. He had come up the steps of the hall 2 at a time, and inside the doors, in the cool marble hush of the entryway, he had passed the thing that stopped him cold, a bronze dedication plaque set into the wall beside the inner doors, the kind of plaque a cadet walks past 10,000 times without ever once reading. There was a portrait etched into the bronze. A woman in a dress uniform, younger, hard-eyed. The ribbon of the Distinguished Service Cross at the top of a rack that ran halfway down her chest. And beneath the portrait, a name. Rowe read it. Then he read it again, because the first time his mind refused to connect it to the wet grass outside. Command Sergeant Major Margaret Sutton, he read aloud, alone in the marble quiet, his voice cracking. Called Blackthorn, 1968. His eyes went up above the inner doors to the letters he had walked beneath every single day of his cadet life without once looking at them. Sutton Hall. That's her. That's the lady on the grass. Oh no. He never reached the staff office. He did not have to. The superintendent had already been at the tall window of his office overlooking the quad, a coffee going cold in his hand, watching the small, ugly scene form on the lawn below his hall and rising slowly out of his chair as understanding arrived. Major General Harlan Voss was 56 years old and had commanded soldiers in 3 wars, and he crossed his own quad now faster than his staff had ever seen him move. He came off the steps and across the wet grass, and he did not stop until he was 3 feet from the old woman in the red coat. And then he came to attention, and he saluted her, and he held the salute before he said a single word. The quad went utterly silent. 30 cadets stared at a 2-star general saluting the old woman they had been laughing at. "Sergeant Major Sutton," Voss said, and his voice was not steady. "The Academy is honored to have you on these grounds, and I am ashamed it took us this long to come out that door." "I'm sorry, ma'am." The old woman returned the salute, unhurried and correct, the gesture of a person who had rendered and received 10,000 of them. "General," she said. "It's all right. I only came to see him." Her eyes went briefly to the hall. "I always come on this day." Voss lowered his hand and turned, slowly, to face Blake Ferris, and every trace of the man who had just apologized was gone. He lifted one arm and pointed, not at the cadet, but up, at the letters carved deep into the gray stone above the door of the building they were all standing in front of. "Do you know whose name that is, cadet?" Voss said. His voice was very quiet, and it carried to every corner of the silent quad. "That is her name. That building is named for the woman you just put down onto the grass. You shoved a Distinguished Service Cross recipient onto her knee, on the lawn of her own hall, in front of the Corps." Blake Ferris's face began to move. First the smirk, still hanging there out of pure habit, a thing his mouth was doing without his permission. Then confusion, as the words arrived and did not fit. Then disbelief, a small shake of the head. "No, that's not." Then his eyes went up to the carved letters he had walked beneath 1,000 times, Sutton Hall, and came back down to the old woman's face, and the two things connected at last, and the color left him entirely. Recognition, and behind it, coming up fast and complete, horror. Boots sounded on stone. Colonel Dean Marsh, the commandant of cadets, arrived at a hard clip with 2 staff behind him, took in the entire scene in one sweep. The general, the old woman, the cadet, the grass, and his voice cracked across the quad like a rifle shot. "Corps of cadets, attention!" The sound of an entire quad of young people coming to attention at once is a physical thing, a single hard snap, and it happened now. Every cadet on the lawn locked upright, chins in, eyes forward. Several of them, the older ones, who understood exactly what a Distinguished Service Cross was and exactly how few living people wore one, brought their hands up in salute and held it toward the old woman in the plain red coat. The boy who had been filming let the phone fall to his side, forgotten, still recording the sky. For a long moment, nobody on the quad moved at all. The wind moved the flags on the parade field, and nothing else. A 2-star general stood bareheaded on a wet lawn beside an 80-year-old woman in a red coat, and around them, the whole accumulated bearing of the Corps held its breath. The older cadets understood first, the ones who had studied the citations, who knew that the pale blue and white of a certain ribbon meant a person had done something on the worst day of their life that most soldiers were never asked to do, and that the ones who wore it and lived were very, very few. Those cadets held their salutes and did not waver, and 1 or 2 of them had gone pale because they had walked past that plaque 1,000 times too, and they were doing the same arithmetic Emmett Rowe had done in the marble quiet, and arriving at the same sick answer. Rowe himself had come back out onto the top step, and he stood there looking down at the scene he had set in motion with 4 words, and he did not feel proud of it. He felt the particular hollowness of a young person watching the adults he had summoned confirm something terrible that he had only suspected. Blake Ferris stood at rigid attention with the wet grass still dark on both knees of his trousers, staring up at a name he had passed every day of his life and never once read, and understanding, finally and completely, and far too late, what he had spent the morning laughing at. The old woman looked at all of it, the general, the saluting cadets, the frozen quad, and something in her face wasn't triumph. It was tired, and it was old, and it was almost sad. Colonel Marsh came to stand before Blake Ferris, and there was no theater in him at all, only the cold, flat fury of a professional whose institution has been shamed. "Cadet Sergeant Ferris," Marsh said, "you are relieved, effective this instant. Your rank, your privileges, all of it, as of right now. You will report to my office and you will wait for me there, and you will not speak to anyone on the way. That video your friend was so proud to make is now evidence in front of a conduct board, and I promise you, it will be watched, frame by frame." He leaned in half an inch. "You had better pray. This woman is more merciful than that board is going to be, because the board is not going to be merciful at all." Ferris's mouth opened. Whatever was in it, an excuse, an apology, a plea, none of it made it out. He shut his mouth. His eyes were wet. He looked 12 years old. General Voss turned to the old woman, and his voice gentled entirely. "Sergeant Major, it's your call. Truly. You say the word, and this young man's time at this academy ends this morning. After what I just watched, no one in the Army would question it. What would you have me do?" Everyone on the quad waited. The old woman took her time. She looked at Blake Ferris for a long moment, at the wet knees, at the wet eyes, at the terrible dawning knowledge in a young face. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and it was kind, and it left no room for argument. "They're just boys," she said. "They haven't been taught yet. That's not a crime. That's just a thing that hasn't happened to them." She shook her head slowly. "Don't end him, General. Anybody can end him. That's the easy thing, and it teaches nobody anything. Teach him instead. That's what this ground is supposed to be for. That's the whole reason my name is on that wall, so that this place keeps making people better than the people who came before. Ending this boy doesn't honor that. Fixing him does." Voss looked at her for a long moment, and then he inclined his head, because there was nothing in the world to say to that. Colonel Marsh, standing a pace behind the general, looked at the old woman for a long moment, and some of the cold fury went out of his face and was replaced by something closer to grief, or to shame, or to the particular ache of a career soldier, realizing he has just watched a better soldier than himself teach a lesson he had forgotten he needed to learn. He did not withdraw the relief. Ferris would still stand before the board, would still answer for the grass and the shove in the video. But he understood now that the punishment and the teaching were two different things, and that the old woman had just handed him the second one for nothing. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault. and let this old woman's story find the people who need to hear it. There are more of them out there than you think, walking slowly across cold lawns in plain coats, and the least we owe them is to look up at the name over the door. The old woman turned then and looked at Blake Ferris, and she did a thing that surprised everyone on the quad. She did not ask a general or a colonel or a staff officer for what she wanted next. She asked the boy. "Young man," she said, "not the general. You. I'd like you to walk me inside. My knees aren't what they were, and there are steps. And I want to show you something. Will you do that?" Ferris stared at her, Then he came out of his rigid attention, and he crossed the grass, and he offered the old woman his arm, the same hand, that had gripped and shoved and marched her, offered now like it belonged to a different person. She took it, and the two of them walked slowly together, up the wet grass, up the stone steps, and in through the tall doors of Sutton Hall, with the entire silent corps watching them go. Inside, the marble was cool and quiet. She let him lead her past the bronze plaque, with her own younger face on it, down the length of the entry hall, to the far wall, the memorial wall, where names were cut into stone in long, clean columns, the names of the Academy's dead. She stopped in front of one column, and she reached up, slowly, and she laid 2 fingers against a single engraved name. Eli Hartshorn. "I didn't turn the letters over that door," she said. She did not look at the boy. She looked at the name under her fingers. "That's the thing nobody understands, and it's the thing I came to tell somebody today, and I suppose it's going to be you. I came home. That's all I did. I was good at coming home, and I was good at bringing other people home. And one time I couldn't, and this is his name, and it should be his name over that door, and not mine." Her fingers pressed against the stone. "He was 24. He taught me to fish. He went into the water so 4 other men could get out of it, and I couldn't bring him back, and they gave me a medal for the ones I saved and put my name on a building, and every single year on this day I come here, and I stand in front of the name that should be up there, and I tell him I'm sorry, and I tell him I'm still trying to be worth it." She turned, finally, and looked at Blake Ferris, and there were no tears on her face, only that great, worn calm. "He's the reason I'm old enough for you to laugh at," she said. "So when you laugh at an old soldier, son, you go easy. You have no idea whose name they're carrying in their pocket. You have no idea what they left in a river so that you could stand on a nice safe lawn in a nice pressed uniform and make a joke. Now, you don't owe me anything, but you owe him. Everybody who walks under that door owes him. So be worth it. That's all I'll ever ask you. Be worth it." Blake Ferris looked at the name in the stone and at the old woman's fingers resting against it, and something in him that had been hard and loud and empty that morning cracked all the way open, and he began, quietly, without any performance at all, to cry. The old woman let him. She did not comfort him too quickly, the way you might comfort a child who has scraped a knee, because what he was crying about was not a scraped knee, and to rush it would have cheapened it. She kept her fingers on the name in the stone, and let the boy stand beside her and come apart. And when the worst of it had passed, she reached over with her free hand and rested it once, briefly, on his shoulder, the same shoulder at the same height, that his hand had crossed to shove her an hour before, the distance closing now in the other direction. "There," she said quietly, "that feeling right there. Hold on to it. That's the thing that's going to make you worth the door." She took her hand back. "Now walk me down the steps. Slowly. My knees, remember. And Blake Ferris, 20 years old, and hollowed out and beginning already to be someone better, wiped his face with the sleeve of his gray uniform and offered the old woman his arm again. And this time, there was nothing performed in it at all. Outside, the Corps still stood at attention on the wet grass. Amos Crutchfield leaned on his broom in the shadow of the north colonnade and watched the tall doors close behind the old woman and the boy. And he took off his cap, and he held it against his chest, and he stood that way for a while in the cold. He had watched a great many people cross a great many pieces of ground in his life, and he knew, now, that he had just watched one of the best of them come home to a building the rest of the world had forgotten to read. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.